we're in a very unique position right now in the political industry of talent. These folks are finding jobs. It's just not necessarily where we want them to.
I'm Eric Wilson, managing partner of Startup Caucus, an investment fund and incubator for Republican campaign technology. Welcome to the Business of Politics show. On this podcast, we bring you into conversation with the entrepreneurs who build best-in-class political businesses, the funders who provide the capital, and the operatives who put it all together to win campaigns. We're joined today by our entrepreneurs in residence. First is Nathan Calvert, who is the founder of Revered. Revered is looking at ways to professionalize employment in the Republican campaign space. So things like payroll, HR, and Jonathan Gallegos is the founder of GOPjobs.com, which is the leading jobs board for the Republican market. So if you are hiring or looking for a job, you need to go to GOPjobs.com. Everyone's using it. Thousands of resumes there. Lots of really great employers. We're certainly seeing difficulty hiring across industry. What does the hiring situation look like in politics? Nathan, you start us off.
Every campaign I've talked to that's gearing up for the midterms or just got off of an off-year election all had a problem of finding not lower staff, but your field staff, even your campaign managers for your state house races, any staff for down ballot races. That was where the big struggle is mainly being seen. I think the consultants and committees kind of have what's more of a mature base to pull from, whereas the campaigns specifically, especially those first-time job seekers in the political field, they're struggling just as I would even say COVID didn't help, but it shined a light on a problem that they were already struggling with. So this is 18 was just as hard as this was.
Got it. So, Jonathan, do you agree with that? Is this COVID plus a trend that we were already seeing, maybe generationally or just in the evolution of campaigns?
I do agree with that. And I heard this term recently. It's a lot of people are coining this era as sort of the great resignation. And, I think for a lot of folks,
I never know if that's like an attitude of like, we're just all resigned or if people are quitting their jobs. So I'm glad you cleared that up for me.
I don't know if I cleared it up, but I have heard it too. And I mean, for me, I think it speaks to, you see COVID happening, right? You see everyone has had maybe a friend or family member or somebody, not too far disconnected that was adversely affected. And so it kind of makes people take stock personally. What do I want to do? What do I stand for? How do I want to spend my time? And I think for some, this has actually been a driver into the political realm. People who may not have traditionally held a political job or even seen themselves as being political, look at those core values and see where they fit with their career. So is it a trend that, I think it was a trend to kind of move that direction pre-COVID, but I think COVID has definitely accelerated it or shined a light, like Nathan said. And but the early signs, I think, of that happening were already there pre-COVID.
So I, as both of you have had to move for political jobs. Being on the ground is really important and for a lot of different ways. And I don't know that that's going to change, but how have campaigns and political organizations adapted to remote work from what you're seeing with employers?
There are jobs that we're going to be able to do remote, and there's jobs on the campaigns that you're simply not. And I think, and Jonathan might be able to go into this a little bit more, especially as he's seeing the jobs that are being posted on GOP jobs and what some of those requirements might have been changing if they are up longer than they thought they should be. But really, I think that there's going to be a big push, especially in our industry, on even jobs like communications directors. I think a lot of those folks are going to be wanting to do this remotely. And they're going to have a very good argument for congressional campaigns to say, I want this salary and I want to do this job remote. And you say, no, I have to have you on the ground. And they say, great, this nonprofit is going to pay me twice as much and I can be remote. So it's almost like we're in a very unique position right now in the political industry of how are we going to react to that question? Because I think Jonathan sees it too on GOP jobs. Talent, these folks are finding jobs. It's just not necessarily where we want them to. So like you said, Eric, I think that it doesn't necessarily answer your question, but I think it does kind of show that normal roles that I have moved for on campaigns are going to have to adapt to become remote in the future if you want to retain a certain level of talent.
Right. And so, Jonathan, what does that look like practically? Because we promised folks really actionable insights. So I want to drill that down. Like, what are you seeing people talk about this in their job postings or hearing this from job seekers? Yeah. So I think, how are we seeing this play out, right? And that's a desire from the talent, the job seeker, to work remotely, and sort of an acceptance, I think, of employers that this is kind of where the talent wants to move. And I have seen it in job postings. A lot of people are saying, this is a remote job, either permanently or temporarily, without any immediate plans to return to office, but the possibility of that. And I've seen employers specifically say, to Nathan's point, that this is not a remote job. Some jobs just, you can't knock on a door remotely, So, I think there's... The FBI has that robot for hostage negotiations that has like the shotgun and the telephone, maybe. Yeah, we should look into that technology. But yeah, I mean, I think, at the end of the day, people want to have that flexibility, right? That's what I'm seeing from employers. And it's less about remote work in the sense that they want to sit in front of a computer alone in their house from 9 to 5. And it's more of the mentality of, getting work done at less traditional schedules, right? So they have a family, maybe they've got friends, there's events that they want to attend that matter more to them. And so having this sort of personal values coupled with professional work, I think we're going to see a lot more mingling of that in the future. Yeah. And I do think, and I've heard this from campaigns, particularly in rural areas, like some of the bigger states out west, that they've been dealing with this pre-COVID, where, it's very difficult to get people, particularly as you see Gen Z and Millennials move to the big cities where they want to have family and careers and access to all these perks, that they've had to accept that. And so I think it's changing the way campaigns are run and actually putting a lot more power or influence in the hands of your grassroots volunteers, the people who live on the ground. And so that's just to plug some of the other companies that we work with in Startup Caucus, like Numenar and Swipe Red, where they're giving more robust tools to people on the ground, so you can kind of complement that remote workforce of sort of experts that may work on a multiple different campaigns or be remotely and only come in once a month. To what extent is this shift being driven by freelancers? I've seen this in several areas of politics. At first, it was social media, where elected officials were kind of laggards to platforms like Twitter and Facebook. But now it's hard to imagine a world where a politician is not on a social media platform. I think similarly, we as an industry are laggards to sort of adopt freelancers. But I think that is sort of a macro trend that is impossible to stop. And I think that smart organizations will see that trend early and sort of will embrace it, because the fact is that you can have and hire the best talent from just about anywhere without having to have them physically located there and or deal with the sort of HR overhead that comes with a full-time employee in your office, drinking coffee and drinking your water bill and all that goes with it. So I think it's on its way here. And so, I mean, I think that's a really interesting point too, because we're seeing so much specialization within politics. Like, you have the people who are just like really sharp on data. no one campaign can really afford, nor should they monopolize that expertise. And so we're seeing a little more specialized firms, specialized freelancers. Nathan, you study this quite closely. What are the advantages to freelancer versus having full-time staff and the ease of setting up your own consulting firm?
Yeah, and I think that Jonathan made a really good point that, especially with the freelancing from the social media standpoint. But I see some people in the chat here who work at some larger firms. I mean, there are plenty of large consulting firms in our industry right now that still outsource graphic design for direct mail, and they have a handful of people who they send those talents to. We're only going to start doing that more, not just for graphic design. It is eventually, like Jonathan said, we are eventually going to evolve into that. From now, as what you're pointing out, Eric, is that from a consultant side, from your bringing on a freelancer compared to a campaign bringing on a freelancer, I think there's some different benefits there. I think ultimately, the party as a whole and the industry as a whole, we do a bad job of defining to the staff that we're hiring the difference between them being a full-time staffer or a freelance staffer. There are plenty of people, and I was one of them, that jumped from state level campaign to state house campaign. By definition, I was 1099'd through every campaign, and I jumped from campaign manager to campaign manager to campaign manager. I was a freelance campaign manager.
Right.
I did not realize I was. I did not know I was. No one in the industry said that's what you're doing. But that was my practice for, 3 to 4 years. And I'm not the only person that's done that. So I think that it's almost what we're labeling it right now, just as much. It's already been in practice, what Jonathan was saying. But the benefits are wildly easier on a campaign if that staffer is full-time. Mm-hmm. And there's a benefit not only for your bookkeeping, it's a benefit for your payroll, and it's a benefit for that staffer, because when they eventually apply for the next job, it doesn't look like they were just hopping from campaign to campaign. It shows that there's some solid experience and growth that's happening that you are then able to track to the next campaign or the next consulting firm. So there are, like I said, it depends on what side of the coin you are, if you're the campaign side or if you are the consultant side.
I want to shift gears now to the hiring and how we get people, because I think we've got a good backdrop for what the situation is like. But, one thing that we've learned from candidate recruitment over the last few cycles is that when we, as Republicans, do a better job of recruiting candidates that reflect their districts, both in terms of gender, ethnic background, or even, professional experience, Republicans do better. And so it seems to me like we ought to extend this to hiring. And so how do we open up our recruiting? It seems like there's kind of this like college Republican pipeline that we've relied on for a long time. But let me give it to Jonathan first. How do we make it easier for people to get that first campaign job if they don't necessarily know someone in politics or their parents aren't a donor, that kind of thing?
That very question is kind of what drove me to start GOP Jobs, right? And that is to sort of widen the funnel and allow people who, like you said, aren't that campaign donor or friend of a friend model to find, a job that matches with their political passion. And specifically doing that in like hyper-local context, I think is going to be the real benefit in terms of building a campaign staff that is reflective of the demographic of the area. And so I think, I was fortunate to be hired into several jobs because of a friend of a friend. And when I got to a position where I was looking to hire people, I turned around and there was this, the old way of doing things, which is like just shooting an email to your group list and people that you trust. And then, it's such an inefficient way, I think, to find talent, especially when, we have tools at our disposal, like the internet, right? So, it's just getting easier and easier to find those people.
Yeah, I think, and that's obviously the big challenge of recruiting right now, because I get a resume or not a resume, I get a request probably once a day of someone saying, "Hey, do you know someone looking?" And if I did, they would have already gotten a job 6 weeks ago. And we've got to sort of grow the pie. And I think that starts to create a different challenge, Nathan, that you're starting to tackle, is that political jobs are kind of different from a lot of other jobs and careers out there that people might be used to. And so if we're going to bring new people into the process, what does that look like on the actual, retention and bringing them on board side of things?
Yeah, and I think Jonathan laid that out very, very well, and widening the funnel. So what happens once you find that person, right? So you've got your operative, you've got your campaign, you're ready to start. What are your immediate next steps? And the problem is, in today's world, the way this is structured, it is completely different depending on which campaign you talk to. And it's completely different at what level the campaign is. If it's a state level, is this a lieutenant governor's race? Is this a congressional race? Is it U.S. Senate? Everything is different. And it also now depends on who's the GC on that race. Are they onboarding you to work for their firm, or are you working for the campaign directly? There is all of this nothing is the same across the board, period. And that leads to a lot of operatives who get their first job in politics. I'm not speaking for you, Eric, or you, Jonathan, but I'm assuming that your first campaign job was like mine, where you really did not feel like it was a real job. And if you told people what you were doing, they didn't think it was a real job. I know I had the longest time explaining to friends and family what my job was, because it was never professionalized to me from the get-go. There is no, and this is something we're trying to tackle at Revered, is there is no HR departments in these campaigns. There is no onboarding paperwork for a lot of these campaigns. There is no standard W-2 issue or 1099 issue. A lot of this falls to a deputy campaign manager or someone at the consulting firm who doesn't have a background or experience in any of this in setting up payroll. And their job was supposed to be doing something else on the campaign, but instead they're now helping you onboard and figure out how to file your taxes and if you have health care at all and what those look like. So it's really a mixed bag of goods right now. And that's hurting it's hurting the next generation of people who, like we said, like as Jonathan was saying earlier, like if you're looking for a remote job somewhere, there are jobs out there that these people are taking. And if we're not going to step up to the plate on our side of the aisle and make this easier and professional, why would they work for us? Why would you work how are you going to recruit that diverse group you were talking about, Eric, if you're basically treating these people slightly better than the volunteers that you bring in for pizza to make calls? So I think that's just a giant problem that we're facing across the board, and it goes across every race at every level.
Yeah, and I wanted to break there and ask for questions from the audience. And Nathan, Larry has lobbed you a softball right over home plate. But before you talk about this, I think there's a really important challenge here in the political context, because we are governed by campaign finance law. There are hard dollar limits, which is an individual donor can only give $2,900 per election. So if that is your resource allocation, that's the revenue you're getting as a campaign, anything that's going to overhead or things like HR, it really feels like you're wasting that money. And that's sort of the calculus that a lot of campaign managers I think confront. We're starting to see some movement with the FEC where they're allowing campaigns to pay for things like childcare or security, unfortunately, for some of these candidates, that you can use donor money that previously wouldn't have been allowed. But it seems to me like there are some functions that, if we really want them to be part of campaigns, we need to figure out a way to finance them that aren't hard dollars. So Larry's question, Nathan, is, not having an HR department for campaigns sounds like a startup opportunity. Why hasn't anyone done this? I sort of answered the last part with the hard dollar issue with campaign finance, but talk about what you're working on with Revered.
Yeah, that is exactly what we're doing, Larry. We're partnering with a PEO, which is a professional employment organization that handles everything from payroll to HR to recruiting as well. And we're putting together to launch at the beginning of the year in January. Every campaign, no matter the size, will be able to get a customized HR handbook. It will include sexual harassment training. It will include workplace ethics, and it will include a 1-800 hotline. If something occurs on your campaign, or if a staffer, God forbid, something awful happens, there is a number to call. They have something handed to them on their first day of work that says, this is what happens. This is who you can contact. So, and it's going to be a very reasonable price. We're trying to break into the market, but it's ultimately changing that perception of what we're used to. Like you said, Eric, it's not just a hard dollar thing. A lot of it's what Jonathan was saying as well. This is the way it's always been done. Why change it if this is the way we're always doing things? So it's a little bit of a culture change. And you're asking them to spend money on something that's not a TV commercial. It's not direct mail. It's not voter contact. That's the hard sell here. But ultimately, if you can staff up effectively and you can staff up quickly and you can maintain your staff through the length of the campaign, your opportunity of winning is a lot better than the other.
Right. And like, there's another issue here too, which is tail risk, right? So not every campaign is going to have an HR crisis, but some will, and it will be a big problem. And so
it's worth noting as well, not to interrupt, it's happening right now. It's been happening for a long time. There are stories out there. There are terrible stories out there. It's been happening. It's just, we live in a world today where you have to prepare yourself for the worst immediately, especially when the other side of the aisle is so far ahead of us on this issue to where they're unionizing their campaigns.
Yeah. Jonathan, your thoughts on sort of the professionalization and the risks that can, I mean, what are you seeing in the job postings that you're getting, employers addressing this sort of thing to reflect changes in the workplace environment?
That's a great question. I think, GOP Jobs is still, in the grand scheme of things, a young platform, right? So we are, I'd say we skew towards larger organizations such as, agencies or some of the committees or, some of the conferences. We just had a job posting from the House Republican Conference. And so those types of organizations, I think, are well versed in, the HR space, right? And understanding, what needs to be done. I think what Nathan is tackling here is that next wave, that next tier that we need to get buttoned up before, quickly, right? And that's to get these campaigns kind of in a space where, these the new hires and even some of the seasoned hires have a trusted HR source. And so, I'm from my point of view, I'm not necessarily seeing that type of activity, but I know that it's important, right? And it's a big. Nathan and I talked early on from Revered. Months and months ago, early start of GOP Jobs, and he's hit on something big there. So, it's important.
Yeah, and I think we're safe to say Republican campaigns squarely in the right to work camp, no unionization, that sort of thing. Let's get really practical here. If I'm on a campaign, I'm struggling to find a campaign manager, struggling to find a digital director, whatever the role is. and I've exhausted my traditional channels of recruiting. What do you recommend that a campaign try to do? Jonathan, you start us off on this one.
Selfishly, I'd say join GOP jobs, right? I mean, and
absolutely.
And I don't mean that just to grow the platform, but I mean, truthfully, if we can find and build a rallying point for center-right talent across the United States, we will have a place for people to turn to and to go to. And I'm seeing pretty strong adoption to this idea because, the platform last month had 20,000 page views, which is up from the 15,000 page views it had the month before. It's just everything is up and to the right on the trajectory of this platform. We're seeing an average of, probably 8 people a day joining for the first time right now, signing up, being on the email list, submitting their resume. I think there's such a thirst for a place that's vetted and trusted that employers can turn to find people, and then employees know that employers are there and that they can meet. So, that's what I would do. Eric, you said you've exhausted all the traditional avenues. We're definitely not traditional because we're not old enough to be traditional yet. So, I'd say give it a shot.
Nathan, any ideas for out of the box recruiting?
No, I would tell them the exact same thing Jonathan did. I'd say go sign up for GOP jobs. And but I would also plug if it's January of 22, I would also have their campaign create their profile on revered work as well. And I think that I have a slide in one of our pitch decks. I think both of you have seen it. It says we find campaign staff the same way your dad hired a mechanic in the 1970s. And it's just, I know someone.
Yeah.
And that's what we're all talking about when we started this conversation. The problem with that slide is most people still like hiring that way. And that's why it's been so hard for our industry to change, because especially if it's a hyper-local race or a hyper-local, like my home state of Mississippi, there's 4 consultants and it's already kind of predetermined a lot of these things. But what Jonathan and I are talking about is there has to be a shift in the culture. Every other industry has shifted. We are lagging behind greatly. And hopefully we're going to be some avenues, Jonathan, that folks can go to and say, okay, this will work and it can work correctly and professionally.
Yeah. And one thing that I do with campaigns that I work with, particularly on the digital side, is if we can't find an experienced digital director who's worked on campaigns, we can do 2 things. One, we can find someone who is politically inclined. So maybe they come from the Lead Right program that the RNC does that's so good, or they come from something like the Leadership Institute. They've got some political experience and sensibility, and we train them on the digital marketing. That is one path. And then the second is find someone who's really good at digital marketing and teach them about politics. And so those are things that we can do where you mold the talent that you've got. And I think that's an important route that people go to. I think the second thing, I don't understand it, but there's so much cloak and dagger in politics about hiring. Jonathan, I know you've got anonymous job postings on gopjobs.com where it's like a left-handed Midwestern senator on a committee is seeking someone. I'm like, okay, well, if you're really, really trying to get someone good, you're going to need to provide more information than that. And so I think we've got to be why is it a secret that campaigns are hiring staff with certain qualifications? I don't know.
A lot of times, Eric, to the opponent that you're hiding your cloak and dagger, it's not a secret.
Right.
We know that you need a new communications director. I'm your opponent. Your communications are terrible. We know that you should be hiring new people. It's such a strange habit that's been created.
And I think we're going to break it. I want to take Stephen's question real quick. Do you see that unionization having any spillover in the sense that there's a pay increase that creates pressure to raise pay and benefits across campaigns? My sense is that those markets are just so separate. I don't think Republican operatives know what's going on in Democratic campaigns and vice versa. Nathan, Jonathan, anything to add there?
Stories of them unionizing are going to be bigger. So I slightly disagree. I think the staff that's running against that campaign is definitely going to know that campaign is unionized. But I think what it does do is that question highlights another problem is there's no standard pay scale for this industry. It depends on where you're working. It depends on where the campaign is, media markets, all types of other things. But that's another problem is you don't know if this is a $20,000 job or is it a $50,000 job. And we were just talking about the cloak and dagger, and Jonathan, that people they're not putting those figures out. They're not telling you in the job posting that that's what it is. And so yeah, I think it does spill over personally. I think it highlights the fact that we should have a standard base salary for our industry. And it's just a huge problem that we don't.
And we do have the case where there's sort of perfect information, right? Where we can see what other campaigns are paying in terms of salary, which we don't have in the commercial space.
I mean, at this point, we've processed probably 600 jobs on the platform, just job postings, seeing jobs come in and out. I'd say maybe a third of those include salary information. But that is something that I don't want to, show you behind the curtain too much, but that is something we're actually compiling as a data point for employers and for talent to make sure that the market rate exists and that we have something that people can benchmark against. That's
excellent, because you're talking about those first-time job getters, Eric. They have no idea what to expect a lot of times. No, why would they choose to go work on this campaign?
Right. And then on the other side, you see, there's the average cost to win a Senate campaign in 2020 was $27 million. So you think, and certainly there are people who are doing really well on campaigns, but it's not usually those entry level staffers. Given that it's harder than ever to hire, find qualified talent, what do we need to be doing to retain them, keep them on board, keep them happy? Do we need to have the nap pods and snacks and all of the perks that some of these employers offer?
At least got to have an HR department, right?
Yeah.
But I like what Jonathan was just saying about the salaries as well. We have to entice these people to come work for us, and it can't just be on the passion of politics alone. These people are building careers. We want these people that just graduated college to get their first campaign job. We want them running for office one day. We want them running Senate campaigns. We want them hiring people on GOP jobs. Like, we have to start realizing that the way we treat these people and the way we pay these staffers, it literally is the future of not just the party, but it's the future of the candidates too.
Yeah, that's a really interesting observation, because we have been trading for a long time on the prestige of politics, right? The idea of, you are associated with Senator so-and-so or Congressman so-and-so, and you're on their campaign staff, and it's great knowing him or her. That's going away as politicians become increasingly unpopular. So yeah, that's a really good point, Nathan. Jonathan, what do campaigns need to be doing to keep people on board and keep them happy?
Yeah, I think the one thing that I would say is values, right? And so, I mean, you've heard the saying that people don't quit a job or company, they quit a boss, right? And so I think, a good team can make a really bad job bearable. And the inverse is true, right? Like a really bad team can make a really great job unbearable. And so my advice is just to slow down on the hiring. I think there's you get a resume that comes in and there's some interest. And I would really kind of lean into, culture fit, values-based hiring, making sure that these people are going to be the type of person that you want in your organization. And, I think long-term, it may be a slower approach to hiring, but I think you'll have better results. And you'll have people that are happy to be there, and you're happy that they're there. So,
right. So it sounds like there's some intangibles here, which are not, so it's not necessarily like, okay, we may not be able to compete dollar for dollar on salary or or on all the perks. And oh, by the way, every federal holiday is one of the busier days of the campaign. So competing on mission, on experience, on values. And so I think that requires campaigns and candidates to be really clear on that. I'm involved with a campaign where there's a, sort of a team manifesto that everyone reads, and we understand what those values are. And it's something, rather unique. Thanks for listening. You can learn more about both of those founders, Jonathan Gallegos and Nathan Calvert, in the show notes. And I hope you got some really useful tips about how to build out your campaign team, because the election year is obviously underway and we've got a lot of work to do if you're building out a team. And so these platforms can be resources for you. We'll be back soon with more episodes of the Business of Politics show. Thanks for listening.